Hello, welcome, and an excellent evening. Today, I want to have a look together with you at a new product for the Commodore 264 range, which includes the Plus4 and other machines that are here, namely the FPGA TED. And let's have a quick look at what's inside of this electrostatic safe box. And it is this wonderful little PCB with pin headers at the bottom. And as you might have guessed, this is a re-implementation of the TED chip, which is the centerpiece of the range of TED machines that Commodore produced around 1985. They were mostly a commercial flop, but we'll talk about that in a minute or so and see what's there. So the main function of the TED is video and audio and also input, like keyboard and joystick. So if the TED dies in one of these machines, which is not uncommon because MOS, which is the semiconductor fab that Commodore owned back then, had a couple of issues during that time, and there's certain revisions of the TED and of the main CPU, which is a 6502 derivative, that mean that those will die after a couple of years or decades. And these are relatively expensive to get replacement for. So some nice chap called Istvan Hegedus designed this thing, and it is now available in smaller batches. It is not cheap, but roughly the same price as if you were to buy a TED chip on an original TED chip on eBay, where you never really know if it will be working or not, whereas this will of course be working because it's been tested, it's brand new. It is still not the final release, I think. There are a few smaller issues in the firmware, I was told, which are reflected in certain demos or games that really push the TED chip to its limits. But I think most of the stuff should work fine, and we will try some things out and we'll have a look. One major feature that this thing has is an HDMI socket. I guess this is the regular DVI over HDMI trick. But this could be a selling point for a lot of people as well, because then you can plug in a small lead and route it through the back of the machine, maybe where the modulator was or something, to get HDMI output directly from the machine. I'm not interested in that. I will see if I can test it anyway, just to give you an impression of what the quality is like. But I still rather prefer the S-video or composite output. But that's just me. Also, I have still some CRTs. So yeah, this is already looking good. I'll put this aside. And let's talk very quickly about the Plus4 range or the 264 range of devices. This is the main attraction, so to speak, that Commodore came out in 1985 or 84, I think. Basically, they wanted to have a cheap office computer, which is why the Plus4 has 4 built-in programs, some kind of word processor, spreadsheet, etc. But no one ever used those because they really sucked. They were built into the ROM, but instead of licensing, I guess, some popular programs, they basically wrote their own and they were not very good. The Plus4 has a 6502 derived processor, which is basically the same as the 6502. I think it's called the 8500 or something. I forgot. But it also has 64 kilobytes of RAM and ROM, as I said. The design is quite nice. The keyboard is pretty neat, except for the cursor keys, which are a bit weird, but the layout is at least more sane than on the C64. And it does support the same IEC drives as the C64 and has the same video output as the C64. It has different joystick ports, but I'm using these adapters, which convert from the mini DIN to the regular sockets, because getting joysticks for this is pretty annoying. There's a user port, I think, which is slightly different than the C64, and there's a cartridge port, which is also completely different. And there are only few cartridges made for the TED range, but there are a couple of homebrew cards that you can have, like the Reseed card, which adds a SID chip to the machine, which is supported by a couple of modern games and demos. Other than that, yeah, I do love the design. We won't open up the Plus4 because this is a rather expensive machine, more expensive than some of the others. And Commodore came out with two more machines. The weirdest one, I would say, being the Commodore 116, which was supposed to be a ZX Spectrum killer machine, but it's much more heavy, bulkier, bigger, but has also the terrible rubber keyboard, has only 16 kilobytes of RAM, which is pretty useless. This one here has an upgrade. You can flip it on and off to 64 kilobytes. The keyboard here is, I think, half broken, as it's always. I need to fix it at some point, but I currently don't want to do that because it's, at the moment, it's more like a museum piece. But it is fully working last time I checked it. So we won't open up this one either. This was really a failure because the C64 was already there. I mean, everything that these things could do, the C64 could do as well. And they weren't better in any way. They could produce a little bit more color, but they couldn't do sprites. The TED chip was arguably worse than the VIC-2 chip, except for color. I think it has around 120 colors or something, which can make some games look nice, but it's not worth the hassle. But I still love these quirky machines, especially the 64 kilobyte ones. You can play text adventures on them very nicely because in the standard configuration you have a lot of RAM free, more than on the C64. So the Osmo interpreter runs pretty nicely, and there's a bunch of really fun games and nice demos on there. So if we're not using either of those computers, which one will we use to test? And I think I'm going to use the Commodore 16, which was basically another iteration of the C116, but instead of having an expensive new mold and everything, they just used the bread bin case of the C64, basically unmodified, except that the user port is missing. This one doesn't have a user port at all. The C16 also doesn't have the user port, only the Plus4 has. But other than that, we have the, it's gotten a little dusty here, all the regular stuff in here, the weird tape port. This is different from the normal C64, but you get the datasets for this are easily accessible because they were often sold as a bundle, C16 with a tape drive. And then you have the IEC port and the video port that you already know, the RF modulator, and then the cartridge port that both other machines also have. On the side, there's again the adapter that I'm using for the mini DIN to VSUB 9-pin connections. And it has very similar keyboard to the C64, slightly different keyboard layout. I think this is the C128 or VT style cursor arrangement. So they are not fully compatible, but they use basically the same mechanism, so you can exchange parts between the C64 and the C16. This one also has a 64 kilobyte upgrade, which is reversible, but every 16 kilobyte game also runs on the 64 kilobyte version. So there's no need to keep a machine stock 16 kilobyte, but with 64 kilobyte you can run so much more things, especially modern stuff. Yeah, so let's open this up and test a couple of games or demos, and then compare them to the FPGA TED and see what happens. There we go. This is the opened up C16. And as you can see, this already had a couple of replacements because this one had one of the broken MOS 8501R1 CPUs, which is why this has the CPU for C16, which is a little CPLD, I think, or PAL or something, programmable logic array, together with a stock 6502 that can run at the 1.7 megahertz. Also, the PLA was broken, so there's a replacement PLA in here, a modern one. And there's the extra 64 kilobytes of RAM, which is nice, and you can even toggle it between 16 and 64 kilobytes. It requires an extra address line over here, but everything can be desoldered and the original chips can be put back in place if necessary. These are the bigger DRAM chips plus a couple of extra logic chips here, 257. I think those are multiplexers. And we have the TED chip, which is still working fine, but it also has the cooling things on top of that, heat sinks, because it does run relatively warm. I'm gonna take this out now, and we will try and put in the new replacement. We might have to bend over this one here, and we have to see if the CPU replacement leaves us enough space. Otherwise, this will become a little bit more tricky than anticipated. So let's have a look. The notch is facing that direction, so we'll make sure to put it in the right way. There's a notch here. And I think this will fit in just like that. I'm wondering which way I'm gonna bend the little capacitor, because I don't want to break it, but I think this might fit in just nicely. The resistor here also has to make a little bit of space. Okay, I had to fight a little bit with this, and it does require a significant amount of force due to the pins. Maybe it's even almost better to solder it directly into place, but I managed to do it. These are the cheap single wipe sockets that Commodore used to use. Removing this will be tricky. You need to lever it from both sides equally and very carefully so not to break off the soldered legs. But I think this will stay in here because this is already a heavily modded C16 board. But now it snugly fits. There's no component touching or anything. Seems pretty nice. Next up, we will put in some power and boot this thing, and hopefully it will work. And we can also try out the HDMI port and see how that looks. I plugged in the HDMI, started the recording, turn it on, and yeah, we're getting a screen. It is cut off on the right side. That might be due to my capture device. With the other setup, with the analog setup, I have a little bit of cutoff on the left side, but it is okay. The you might see some patterns in there. That's actually scan lines. This thing does support scan lines, which you might like or might not like. I guess you probably can disable that. I will have to look up in the manual. Maybe there's some peaks or pokes that you can do. But now I can't do anything because nothing's hooked up. We just have the HDMI out. But this is looking good. So let us load up some software and compare this thing. First, I'm going to use the HDMI out directly. And later we will also have a look at the S-video or composite out that's coming out of here. So the keyboard is connected. We can press F3 to load up a directory. There's my disk with all kinds of stuff. I will load the demo phosphorizer, and we can compare it to the original TED, which I already recorded, and see if there's any major difference or if there's any glitches. Hopefully there's none, and then we can compare other games and demos as well. So let's run this. So we are switching between the FPGA TED right now and the original MOS TED every couple of seconds. And one thing I have to note is that on the TED the bass is much bigger and slightly distorted because my capture setup was slightly misaligned. This will be not the case in the other videos I will be showing you. But other than that, I hope you can see the visual differences between the HDMI output of the FPGA TED and the composite output of the original TED. Well, that did look pretty promising. I think this at least works for this demo. But there are more tricky demos, I think, that push the TED to the limit. And we will also have a look at one or two classic games like Tutti Frutti, because all the old games should work reasonably well as well, right? So let's quickly skip through some of those and I will blend back and forth between the different variants and we can see what the differences are. And there will be some flashing lights if you're sensitive to that. Yeah, maybe that's not the best part to watch that, but then demos. And these old games are probably not the best idea anyway. But that being said, let's proceed. This is the demo States United by the Electronic Knights and Bauknecht from 2011. And it uses quite a lot of raster effects, some of which are working fine, but some of which are not so great. Also, there are some heavy differences in the palette. As you can see here on the original TED, we have a gray background and some transparent red stuff. And the 3D cube-ish things in the background or square things look quite colorful, but they should be monochrome or grayscale. So I think this is definitely a difference between the two chip implementations. And it's only one of two demos where I could find definite glitches. There is one glitch that is quite a bit worse, namely in the following 3D segment of this kind of, what do you call it, maybe a 3D wavy street of textures. I don't know, but you can see the original TED manages this quite nicely, whereas the FPGA TED has a glitch. The author is informed and he wants to get rid of this glitch, so in a future update of the FPGA code it might well be fixed already. The FPGA TED also comes with a configuration program, which is actually pretty useful. And you can watch which version of the hardware and software you're running, but you can also enable and disable the scan lines, change the palette colors, and also change the aspect ratio on the HDMI. In the future, you can also set the kernel and the basic version, and you can emulate a SID chip. However, these are not yet implemented, so wait for FPGA software updates, I guess. Plus, the tool is supposed to be able to flash the FPGA as well in the future. So you don't need a special JTAG adapter or anything for the FPGA TED to reconfigure it with new software. All in all, this is a very useful utility, and we've seen similar things on the ARM SID, for example, which can also flash the firmware on that device on the C64.
Made for you.
One of the big games that is very popular on the C16 and Plus4 is probably Lycia, which is a RPG, I would say, Zelda-like action-adventure thing. And it does push the Plus4 into C16 quite significantly with awesome animations and graphics as well as sound. And I can confirm that I didn't see any glitches while test playing Lycia. I didn't play through the whole game, I just played a couple of minutes at the beginning. But I think that will already show most of what you will see in the game feature-wise, I would say. So I can conclude that it probably runs totally fine. I did not test the combination of Lycia with SID sound. There's a special version which supports the SID via a cartridge. But in the future I will test it out when the SID emulation on the FPGA TED arrives. But so far it's looking very good. Another very complex game is Alpha Ray, which is a horizontal scrolling shoot 'em up, your regular R-type clone, so to speak. And it also pushes the TED chip quite extensively. There's high-res text in the intro, very colorful, and as the machine doesn't really support scrolling all that well and doesn't support sprites at all, the software sprites do look very nice indeed. The colors, as I said, minus the palette changes, also look very awesome. And I didn't see any glitches at all in the game. Not that I came very far, but again, another game that does seem to play very well. So far, all the issues that I have seen were only in 2 or 3 demos. Everything else seems to be working fine, which leads me to believe that you can already use the FPGA TED in day-to-day usage, so to speak. If you're playing games, that is, or maybe there's even some productivity software for the C16 or Plus4, but that I did not test. But yeah, Alpha Ray works just fine. And of course, the most important question, does it also work on a CRT? Here I'm running the C16 with the FPGA TED via S-video output, not composite like I did before, S-video output on my Commodore 1084S. And as you can see, it works perfectly fine. So the analog output options for this replacement chip are working perfectly. There is the option of outputting to VGA even via the internal pin header. I didn't test that, but hopefully that should also be possible, and you can then attach it to your PC, CRT or LCD screen, which is a great option to have. But yeah, composite S-video will also work, and of course HDMI for the modern displays. That is all I want to show you today of the FPGA TED, the modern replacement for the TED chip or the MOS 7360 or 8360, which is the heart and soul of all the 264 series machines, the Commodore 116, the Commodore 16 and the Plus4. What do you think about it? Is it worth the money? Because let's face it, this batch of chips cost 64 euros plus shipping, so it's definitely not inexpensive. but you are getting a lot for the money, so to speak. If you're buying an original 8360 right now on eBay, the cheapest ones go for 30 to 40 euros, and you're probably not quite sure if they will be working. There are a couple for 50, 60, or even 100 euros. And yeah, if you want to restore a machine to its original working condition with all original chips, then it might be worth the money for you, taking the risk that you might get a dead chip or one that will fail in the near future. You never know, so to speak. And if you have a working machine, there is no need to replace the working TED chip with this one here. But if you have a dead C16 or plus 4, for example, then the FPGA TED might be very interesting. Or maybe you're building the little 16 replica board with all new stuff, then the FPGA TED is also very interesting. And as I said, you're getting a lot. You're first and foremost getting the HDMI output, which usually sets you back like 20 to 50 euros, depending on your composite or S-video to HDMI converter. So that's some money saved. You've got the HDMI output directly built into this. There is the possibility for the VGA output on this device as well. And in the future, once the FPGA firmware catches up, you can also emulate a SID chip without the need for an external cartridge, which would also plug into and block the cartridge port. Not that there are very many cartridges for the C16 anyway, but that's a nice feature to have it integrated, basically. Yeah, and still you retain the ability to output via composite and S-video and even RF. So that all keeps working, so to speak. So I think even with the firmware being at such a early stage, so to speak, it is definitely worth the money, except for 2, maybe 3 demos where I saw a couple of glitches. I think all the games that you can throw at it will run, especially the ones from the 80s and 90s, if that's what you're looking for. They probably didn't push the TED very hard. The modern homebrew games and demos are much more demanding. They do beat the TED pretty hard. Software sprites, raster effects, stuff like that. But most of that is already working, and Istvan said that he wants to get rid of all the remaining glitches and incompatibilities. So that's pretty neat, actually. Insofar, I will put a link to the FPGA TED website in the video description. But for today, I think that's it. Please share your stories of the C16 and Plus4 line. Did you own one? Did you have the classic basic package with the dataset and the basic instruction course? I think that was probably for a lot of people their first hooray into the world of home computing and computing in general. Otherwise, please share, like, and subscribe, the usual stuff. You can also follow me on Mastodon. I'm pretty active there and reply to most of the stuff that is directed at me. You can find me at chaos.social/@root42. Links are also in the video description. Also, all the possible ways that you can support me via Patreon and other means. So that's it for today. Thank you very much and see you in the next video. Bye.